Hi everyone, and welcome to the second Serious Games lecture that I proposed doing last week in the introduction. And this week we're going to be looking at learning concepts, so learning theories and models, which is particularly important if you're looking at serious games, and I suppose quite important for you guys as well, because you are in honours year now, and it is more or less time to take charge of your own learning and formulate your own sort of metacognitive strategies, shall we say. So, I have stolen Emperor Palpatine here because it's illustrating a point. I don't just put these cool pictures on there for the hell of it. It's really to illustrate the cognitive apprenticeship model of learning, which I've always quite enjoyed. So basically, you have a sort of mentor through the entire course of your learning, and they sort of guide your development, and then that is eventually sort of iteratively sort of taken away, gradually taken away. And you can have mentors through the entire course of your life, and then of course you can disagree with your mentors and you can throw them down a turbo shaft quite easily. So I think that beautifully illustrates that. So in terms of this lecture, we're going to look at what is learning, the characteristics of learning, memory, so we're looking at short-term memory, your sensory store, long-term memory, so that'll be episodic, procedural, semantic memory. Learning to learn, I presume that is talking about metacognition. I should explain that these are a combination of my slides and Professor Conley's slides, who used to run the module before me, and he was in fact my mentor. So, learning to learn, I presume he is talking about metacognition, so I'm having to exercise my memory at this particular point. And then we're looking at Bloom's taxonomy. So Bloom's taxonomy is one of the sort of better categorizations of the learning sort of steps in the literature, one of the better frameworks, or the more reference frameworks. So we have it's split into three different domains. So it's the cognitive domain, the affective domain, dealing with the emotions, and the psychomotor domain as well. And then we're going to look at Kolb's experiential learning cycle. Now, Kolb's experiential learning cycle has four particular kinds of learner. We have assimilators, accommodators, divergers, and convergers. And once again, this is another very well recognized learning model in literature. Now, I'm bringing this up, or I'm doing a lecture on this to sort of help you with your honours projects as well. So if you're looking at learning models or serious games for your honours project, or even learning in the literature at all, then this can be very, very helpful. So you can look at Bloom's taxonomy, you can look at theories of motivation and theories of education as well, and that can assist you with your literature review. And also it's quite important for serious games too. So what is learning? Is it a change in behaviour or understanding? Is it a process? Quite clearly it is all of these things. And for real learning to occur, there must be some form of change that actually takes place. So change in what we know, what we understand, or in what we do. And there of course can be problems if attempts to learn or teach do not result in change, as we all sort of know. So let's have a look at it. Learning can be described as these particular 5 points, I suppose. An increase in knowledge, something done to a student rather than something he does for himself. Now, obviously, the higher you get up the scale of the Scottish Credit and Qualifications Framework, you're all level 10 now, which means you're about to graduate with your honours after this year is over. Level 11 is Masters, and level 12 is PhD. It does sort of depend on where you wish to end the learning process, how you actually see yourself as a developing individual. When do you actually become an autonomous person, an autonomous learner, and take responsibility for your own learning? So some people can actually only go through their entire lives and see this as a process that is done to themselves. They just sort of sit there and expect people to come along and teach them. And if that doesn't happen, then apparently they are incapable of learning. I've had quite a few students in the first and second year wanting to drop out the course because they don't feel in this current climate with COVID and everything that they can actually learn by themselves. Which is a terrible pity, and also a sort of terrible attitude. It's a rather underdeveloped attitude. Now, I can remember that when I was at university, I don't know exactly when I became a fully autonomous human and started questioning everything and realised, I will learn for myself. I don't need anyone else to really teach me. I will interact with other humans and I will learn from interacting with them. But basically, I'm in charge of my own learning. I identify a gap in my knowledge and I fill it if I choose to do so. So, an increase in knowledge, something that is done to someone. So you're sitting in a classroom and you get bombarded by something until something eventually sticks. Memorizing, student activity, so the student actively memorizes, but the information is not really transformed in any way. I remember when I was doing exams, when exams were a thing at university, quite a big part of it really. And I would always write out about 20 pages of notes that I would memorise, or shall we say sample answers to the sample questions for every exam. And then I would write them out in 20 pages over and over again. I would memorise it, I would go into an exam, I would write it all down, I would come out of the exam and flush, and it would all go. And that was memorising it, but not actively transforming it in any way. You can also acquire facts or procedures to be used. So this includes skills, algorithms, formulae, which you need to do things, but still no transformation has actually been learnt by the learner. So when you're considering things like going into the higher maths exam or the advanced higher maths exam, you're given a list of formulae and you just simply utilise that for your own purposes, and you don't really necessarily transform that in any way. Then there's a clear sort of qualitative shift between 3 and 4. This is where you start to make sense. You make active attempts to abstract meaning in the process of learning. You've got to be able to explain things, not just remember them. You recount them in your own words. And then, of course, you start to understand reality. So it enables you to perceive the world differently, and it's personally meaningful. Now, through the entire course of your degree, you'll have presumably done some modules that may have been looked upon as being rather useless, some incredibly useful, but then at some stage you do sort of combine that all together and you realise that someone has sculpted your curriculum in a particular way to hopefully give you an overall holistic sort of view and a good sort of chance at learning everything in the course, and hopefully that's applicable, so you start to understand reality in that context. So there's a sort of a clear qualitative shift between 3 and 4, and you can argue that 1, 2 and 3 are views that underpin surface learning, or 4 and 5, these points here, really relate to deep learning. Okay. So what is it? It depends whether you're focusing on learning as an internal process where information is taken in by your senses and is processed by your brain, or a series of external inputs and outputs. Now, obviously, you can measure external inputs and outputs, but neuroscientists have not yet given a complete answer, and that is because they do not have a bloody clue. Because cutting open someone's brain is entirely unethical, and they're not really allowed to do it while the subject is alive. And even when they do things like that, for example, there was the American serial killer, John Wayne Gacy, who murdered 33 young men. And they did dissect his brain after he was executed in 1994, and they realised that there was no physical abnormality despite the fact that he'd done all of that. So a man's actions doesn't really equal the sum of the psychological parts. It doesn't really work that way, to quote John Malkovich in The Line of Fire. How does it work? It doesn't work, Frank. So neuroscientists haven't yet given a complete answer because they haven't got a clue. External inputs and outputs are easier to track than the internal goings on that forge connections between the two. So certainly outputs of learning are relatively easy to recognise. So you can demonstrate that you know something. I can demonstrate that I can do a Rubik's Cube. I can demonstrate that I can play the piano, that sort of thing. And you can demonstrate that you can do something. And of course, exam marks are sort of indicative of that. With some characteristics, learning is both a process and an outcome, sort of iterative process, and then you realise it's an outcome. It's both formal and informal. In the formal sort of class structure, you're sitting in a classroom and you learn things, you're bombarded with things, and you've got to try your best to sort of cope with that scenario. Informally, if you take, for example, just walking about, navigating, no one really instructs you, except when perhaps you're very, very young, to keep out of the way of people or where to go or look where you're going. You sort of pick that up because you realise very, very quickly that if you don't, you get hurt. It can be both conscious and unconscious, meaning that you actually make the effort. And of course, in terms of being unconscious, you may have sort of read something in a paper and say, wait a minute, I know that. How do I know that? It can be fun, it can be a very, very rewarding process. It can also be very, very nasty. An example of that is once I put my hand in an electric fence, and I realised that electric fences actually work in a sort of current, and that was quite nasty. It can be planned and accidental, pretty much like the electric fence scenario. It can be desirable, useful, beneficial, and it can also be undesirable and incredibly inappropriate. For example, if you were to sexually educate children too early, for example, that can sometimes be incredibly inappropriate. It's both incremental and transformational. To give you an example of that, incremental may be playing scales. I'm gesturing over there, I have a piano over there. Incrementally, you may be playing scales and things like that on the piano. But then, in a transformational sense, you may then be playing Mozart's Alla Turca one day and not even realise how you actually managed to accomplish this. So it's incremental and transformational at the same time. It can be both a social and a solitary activity, depending on preference, perhaps. I think that I'm very old school in that way, where I think if you're going to learn something, you go into a room, you immerse yourself, and you learn it. But some people think that going to the Students' Union is in fact learning, but that really depends on what you perceive or what your preference is. It can both be reactive and proactive. Proactive meaning that you sort of fast forward into the future and realise I must know this. Reactive maybe as a result of appearing to be misinformed or a bit of an idiot, and you think to yourself, I'll educate myself on this. It's about acquiring knowledge and skills. Obviously these are different sort of things. You may have the knowledge, but skills are sort of procedural, perhaps. It's both voluntary and compulsory. We all have to learn to a certain degree. But at some particular stage, we eventually say, I'm going to do this on a voluntary basis. We choose to go and learn about something. It's both recognised and unrecognised. The only sort of slight example I've got there is probably in X-Men 3, The Last Stand, where Colossus throws Wolverine towards Magneto, and he goes, poof, you never learn, do you? At that particular moment, the learning was unrecognised. He says, actually, I do. And Beast appears behind him and stabs him with the cure. And then, that particular moment, learning was recognised. It's both supported and unsupported. It can be shared and private. Some people are very, very private about their learning. They believe that knowledge is power and it shouldn't necessarily be shared ever. It's both superficial, it can be rote, and deep. Internalising principles. Yeah. So when you consider things like this, you've got a little sort of diagram here. There's a scientist with a little microscope. It goes into your sensory memory, and things become relevant to you very, 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 very quickly, or they don't. It's either forgotten, it's a very sort of lossy process, then it's transferred to short-term memory. Once again, it has to be rehearsed. It's either forgotten or it's transferred into long-term memory. So input of sensory information starts at the top, goes through sensory memory or a sensory buffer into short-term memory, and then into long-term memory. So the process is incredibly selective and lossy. At each stage it's filtered. You only focus on the relevant stuff that you really particularly want to focus on. Progression to long-term memory, if it is reached, may well take less than a minute, and it lasts for the rest of your life, and it seems to be almost infinite. Okay? Information may only stay in the sensory buffer for about a 15th of a second while the brain assembles it to make sense. And when you consider the illusion of a series of still pictures, rapidly changing, which is the basis of all cinematography, once frame rate drops below about 16 frames per second, we may well become conscious of the flicker, or jumps from one still image to the other, but the brain assembles it and completes or fills in the gaps for you. Okay. Similarly, we don't hear a series of phonemes or speech sounds, but complete words or phrases. It's as if the brain waits to assemble a meaningful sound before actually passing it to the next stage. And it's very, very, very selective in that sense. I mean, I always remember sort of phoning up my friend's mother, and I knew she would always ask me how I was, and I wasn't interested in speaking to her, and I was like, good, put your son on the phone. And I would always complete the sentence before she managed to complete hers, which was very rude of me, but hey. Short-term memory holds material for about 15 to 30 seconds, although this can be expanded by practice. And you can see how incredibly disabling, damaging this can be in patients with dementia, perhaps. Has a capacity of 7 items plus or minus 2, so that's referring to chunking. That's what we sort of learn in human-computer interaction, where if you've got a menu, its sort of optimum size should be about 7. Plus or minus 2. And it may be hard to remember telephone numbers, for example, and here's my office number. So we employ chunking in that sense in order to remember sort of larger things. So 0141, that's the sort of Glasgow code, 849, sort of region, and 4182, and that's the extension, and that's actually my office number. If we were in fact doing this in a great big huge lecture hall, which we can't, unfortunately, I normally do a sort of example of this where I recite a number which is quite long, and it's 3.14159265401717200100100142074209. Now, that may appear like magic, but I've got 3.1415926540, so that's pi to a certain decimal place. 0171, which is an old PIN number of mine, 7275970, which is an account number, 11001001, which is the name of a Star Trek episode, and 42094207 is my old army number. So there we have it. So it does look almost magical when I do it on a board, but is in fact the mystery is solved by chunking. Okay. So that's a sort of label that we use. Okay. Long-term memory has an infinite capacity and lasts the rest of your life. And it's been suggested that it's 3 components. So semantic memory stores concepts, ideas. Episodic memory contains memories of events. And procedural memory concerns skills and know-how rather than know that knowledge. So if you see people with amnesia, they may be able to sit down at a piano and play and not really realise that they're doing it. Some people have a far greater memory, or not a greater memory, but a better memory than others. For example, I have renowned for having a relatively good memory. I can remember exactly what we had in 1997 when we went to Tony's restaurant in Disney World. My friend had a double chocolate gateau. We all had the spaghetti and meatballs. I had tiramisu, and so did my friend's mother. And he can't even remember being in bloody Disney World at that time, or in the Magic Kingdom. And he seems to find it remarkable that I can remember what everyone had. And it was the biggest slab of chocolate gateau I've ever seen in my life. Okay, learning how to learn. So this is really referring to metacognition. So this is Bateson. So learning 0 is direct experience. I put my hand in the fire and it gets burnt. Learning sort of level 1 is what we routinely refer to as learning generalization from basic experience. I've experienced my hand in the fire and being burned. I won't do it again. The sort of level 2 contextualizes this. I don't generally risk getting burned, but I might do so to save someone else from a fire, or a pet perhaps, or whatever. And learning 3 contextualizes learning 2, and it's not fully understood. So what does it say about me that would risk getting burned in order to? Yeah? So metacognition. So here's a sort of table that tells you about deep and surface learning, or compares the two. So deep learning really relates theoretical ideas to everyday experiences. Emphasis is internal from within the student. Relates knowledge from different courses, so you're kind of concising, synthesizing everything into to meaningful applications. And then surface is you focus on the signs, unrelated parts of the task, you're just simply there to pass. Task is treated as an external imposition more than anything else. Oh damn, I have to learn this and keep it in my brain, why? Surface learning is really trying to suss out what the teacher wants in order to provide it. And that's basically why everyone is just ultimately interested in assessments and getting the score. So you're trying to figure out exactly what is required and provide that. And it's motivated primarily by fear of failure, perhaps. So tends to be experienced as an uphill struggle, surface learning, and you're always sort of fighting against the boredom and depressive feelings. Depressive feelings is probably a bit strong. So deep learning is experienced as exciting and a gratifying challenge, and that's probably linked to sort of motivation. We'll get into motivation here. So although learners may be classified as deep or surface, they're not attributes of individuals. One person may use both approaches, and it's nowhere near as simplistic as that. You don't just get a surface and a deep level. Everyone is probably a combination of both, and they switch because humans are relatively sophisticated. So they correlate deep learning very closely with intrinsic motivation. It's seen as innately challenging, innately rewarding, and surface with extrinsic. So there's some form of tangible reward. So if you consider actually working towards an assessment and working towards a score and passing an exam, or working for money, perhaps. So either approach can be adopted by a person with either sort of motivation, okay? The third form is known as achieving, or a strategic approach, a sort of very well organized form of surface approach in which the motivation is really to get good marks. And let's face it, the motivation is always to sort of get good marks in a way, but also enjoy it, I would say. The exercise of learning is construed as a game, so the acquisition of technique improves performance, and it works as well as the analogy. Insofar as learning is not a game, it breaks down, yeah? So Bloom's taxonomy, when we're considering that, it is 3 domains. So we've got the cognitive domain, the affective domain, and the psychomotor domain. So suggested that one cannot effectively or ought not to address higher levels until these levels below them have in fact been covered. So in the cognitive domain, and Professor Conley hated technicians, I think, training for technicians may cover knowledge, comprehension and application, but isn't concerned with analysis or anything above. Whereas full professional training may be expected to include synthesis and evaluation as well. So if we look at the cognitive domain, the most used of domains is referred to as the sort of knowledge structure here. So down at the bottom we have knowledge, and progressing up here through comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis and evaluation. And it can be viewed as this sort of successive sequence, progressive contextualization of material perhaps. Okay. So let's have a look at what some of these categories in the cognitive domain actually mean in terms of sort of putting them through a sort of thesaurus, categorizing them. So knowledge, you're enumerating, you're reproducing, you're stating, you're listing, you're matching, you're naming. Comprehension, you're classifying, you're paraphrasing, you're restating your own words, you're summarizing, you're tracing. Application, you're assessing, you're demonstrating, informing, instructing, projecting, teaching, transferring, using, applying. Analysis, you're categorizing, you're discriminating, or contrasting, differentiating, prioritizing, synthesizing, you're incorporating, validating, negotiating, facilitating. Evaluation, you're comparing and contrasting, perhaps again, interpreting, judging, justifying, reframing, supporting. And then we get to the affective domain, where you're probably, we're looking at emotion in this particular domain. So you receive an emotion, you respond to that, you value, you organize and conceptualize it, and you characterize by value or value concept. So I've had to put the dog down. I'm very, very upset by that. I'm responding to it. I then value the dog's life and think to myself, oh, you know what, it was special to me, and it's categorized, compartmentalized in my brain. I'm conceptualizing it there, and categorizing by value or value concept. So I realize that if I go out and get a new dog, I'm not entirely betraying the memory of the old one, if that makes sense. At least it does to me. Psychomotor, this includes physical movement, so coordination, so motor skills, so it requires a bit of a precision, distance, procedure, technique and execution. So if you're actually considering something like learning a martial art or whatever, it begins with imitation, manipulation, precision, and then it becomes naturalization. Now this is based on Dave 1975. And obviously if you've ever, I presume not many of us have, but I have, if you go to a martial arts class or a Zumba class, Zumba is actually non-instructional. So you get this sort of blonde girl going, woo, woo, and she does all this sort of dancing, and you're supposed to mimic that, and eventually that will come into naturalization if you do it often enough. But I didn't. Okay, Kolb's experiential learning cycle, I believe it's 1984. It's probably one of the most useful descriptive models of adult learning. So do cover that if you're covering that in your sort of literature review for learning. Not sufficient simply to have an experience in order to learn it. You've got to reflect on that experience, and it may quickly be forgotten, and the learning potential lost if you don't reflect on it. And it's from these feelings and thoughts emerging from this reflection that generalizations or concepts can in fact be generated. Okay, and it's these generalizations which enable new situations to be tackled effectively, shall we say. So similarly, it's intended that behaviour should be changed by learning. It's not sufficient simply to learn new concepts and develop new generalizations. You've got to test knowledge in new situations, make links between the theory and the action, planning for that action, carrying it out, and then reflecting upon what actually happens and relating it back to that theory. So it's not really enough just to do, neither is it enough just to think, nor is it enough simply to do and think. Learning from experience must involve links between doing and thinking. So it's a very, very sort of good representation in the literature. So when you consider, and this is the joy of this particular cycle, is that you can leap into it at any point. So you've got concrete experience, observation, reflection, forming abstract concepts, and then testing it in new situations. So if you consider something like when you're young and you're wanting to ride a bike, perhaps, you look at the big boys and say, oh, I'm observing and reflecting, those big guys can go a bike, I'm thinking about that myself, I'm forming abstract concepts, and I'm thinking I can actually visualize me doing this, or were you at age 4? Test that in new situations, and then the concrete experience is probably when you slam your head down in the concrete like I did. I didn't fall off my bike very often, I was actually very proficient at it. But you get the concrete experience of riding a bike, and guess what? You never forget how to ride a bike. No one ever does. And it's sort of the same if you consider like an experiment, something like that. You have the concrete experience of previous experiments. You observe and reflect. You possibly test out a new experiment based on these experiments if you're a chemist or a physicist or something like that. And then you enter into the cycle at a different sort of level. So concrete experience is really doing, observing, thinking, and planning. Yeah. So concrete experience actually relates to two ways of knowing, which by direct experience, apprehension, or knowing about comprehension. So concrete experience corresponds to direct practical experience. So apprehension versus knowledge about something, which is theoretical, okay, and represented by abstract conceptualization. And then, of course, there's the two ways of understanding or transforming knowledge. So reflective observation focuses on what the experience means to the experiencer. So you've got intention, or its connotation, and then active experimentation, which is denotation. Okay? And transforms theory of the abstract conceptualization by testing it in practice by extension, and relates that to its denotations. Okay? And we consider that Kolb's experiential learning theory has, or learning cycle has, four particular kinds of learners. So I've mentioned that before: assimilators, divergers, convergers, and the other one. So I put that into a sort of paper before. Okay, theories of education, constructivism. We'll have a look at that. So basically that's sort of problem-based learning, where you construct new knowledge from sort of previous experience. Motivational theories, we'll look a little bit at that. Intrinsic motivation, extrinsic motivation, we have mentioned it before. So self-determination theory, self-efficacy theory, things like that. So these are quite useful if you're looking at it in your honours project. So flow theory, Mihail Csikszentmihalyi, I believe came up with that, or his PhD students called him Mike. So flow theory, very famous, 1992, Hungarian professor. Situated learning, problem-based learning, cognitive apprenticeship, my personal favourite. Learning by doing, and learning is sort of an inherently social. Now, theories of education by creating virtual worlds, computer games, relating it to computer games, not just knowing and doing, games bring together ways of knowing, ways of doing, ways of being, and ways of caring. So the situated understandings, effective social practices, powerful identities, and shared values that make someone an expert. So that's according to Schaefer, Squire, Halverson, and G. And they're relatively big at theories of education and games-based learning. So constructivism, this is viewed as a sort of active process in which learners construct the new ideas or concepts based on current or past knowledge. Okay, so learner selects and transforms the information, constructs some form of hypothesis, makes decisions relying on the cognitive structures to do so, and focuses on knowledge construction and not necessarily reproduction. So you're sort of testing out new scenarios. So it can contrast with the sort of traditional didactic approach, which views learning as passively receiving information. Okay. So motivation is a very, very sort of critical factor. So self-determination theory, Deci and Ryan distinguish between the two different types of motivation. So we have intrinsic motivation, doing something for the innate joy of it, and extrinsic motivation, doing something because of some sort of tangible reward. Once again, I don't necessarily think that it's quite as simplistic as categorizing these two different kinds of motivations into two different things. I think humans are incredibly complex, and that it is an intermingling of the two. For example, I decided to go to Thai boxing to defend myself and beat people up, which was extrinsically motivating, or at least it was going to be. And then I started to find that I was enjoying it, which led to a sort of cycle of intrinsic motivation as well. So it seeped into intrinsic motivation after extrinsic, which I think happens with myself a lot. Okay. Malone and Lepper presents a sort of theoretical framework of intrinsic motivation from 1987, and they postulate that intrinsic motivation comes from four individual and three interpersonal factors. So I've actually used this in a number of papers before, and I polluted the games-based surveys asking about why people played computer games, and I always used Malone and Lepper's 1987 framework of intrinsic motivation because it is a recognised framework. Now, you may wish to do something like that in your honours project. If you're doing something like that, then it's good to do some form of recognised framework, or use a recognised framework, recognised questionnaire that is sort of psychologically valid, psychologically proven, and then you can construct a questionnaire from that, and that is all the better for it. Yeah. So, in terms of the intrinsic motivation, in terms of the individual factors, we have challenge, fantasy, curiosity, and control, and the interpersonal factors: cooperation, competition, and recognition. And these things are possibly sort of related to, shall we say, multiplayer games when you look at them. So, cooperation, competition, and recognition. Yeah. So challenge, the player must be able to vary the difficulty of the game. It has to be optimally challenging. If things are far too difficult, then people invariably get bored, and if not, then once again, invariable boredness, shall we say. There should be sufficient randomness as well. Fantasy, the player should feel involved in the gaming environment. Curiosity, so sort of sensory stimulation, enough novelty to keep it going. The player should also feel in control over the game activities, and make choices and witness what happens, witness the effects of those choices. And whether if the choices are unclear, then they have the ability to actually gather information and make an informed choice. Cooperation, the player should feel satisfaction helping others, perhaps. Competition should feel satisfaction by comparing their performance favourably to that of others. And recognition should feel satisfaction when others recognise their particular accomplishments. Now, I know that probably in this class we have a number of different kind of gamers, and different kinds of gamers, and whether those people are cooperative, competitive, individualistic, I'm not entirely certain. I would say that I'm quite a competitive gamer, and I don't necessarily want to view my performance or compare it to other people favourably, and it really depends on what kind of underlying person you are. So flow theory, achieve when the challenge level matches the player's skills, so there's got to be some form of optimum experience. There have to be rules, a goal, a way of obtaining feedback, and one must be able to concentrate and interact with the opportunities at a level commensurate with one's skills. Okay, so if the tasks are too difficult, then it raises anxiety. If they're too easy, then they contribute to boredom. And both of these situations do result in demotivation. So, flow is characterised by a feeling of being in control, highly focused. You experience sort of lapses in time as well. So conditions likely to induce a flow state are challenge, optimally challenging. Once again, should be easy to isolate the activity. Performance criteria should be clear performance criteria. Feedback, you should see the effects of your choices. And in terms of situated learning, learning is viewed as a function of activity, okay? Problem-based learning, very, very big in the 1960s. When I learned systems programming in C back at university in 2000, there was this lecturer who was very, very up on problem-based learning, and he never really taught a class, to be perfectly honest. He just set you a problem every single week, and that was it, and go away, do the programming activity and come back. So it's really sort of deeply rooted in medicine. Students were tasked to diagnose patients' conditions and justify the diagnosis, and then they have to generate the hypothesis, discuss the symptoms, that sort of thing. And the end of each session, they all reflect. So it's very, very, it's a constructivist theory. Problem-based learning, the cognitive apprenticeship model, the teacher facilitator is available for consultation and plays a significant role at the beginning, and in modelling the sort of metacognitive thinking and the problem-solving process. And then, of course, as these skills develop in the student, the scaffolding is essentially removed and the coaching is removed. And the intention is to force learners to assume as much of the task on their own as soon as possible. It's very, very effective actually. So also advocates modelling, which involves a sort of expert, so the teacher performing a task so the student can observe, articulation, verbal or written reflection to enable the learners to compare, and exploration as well. So learning by doing, once again we're sort of talking about metacognition here. Many learners prefer to learn an activity by actually doing it, particularly when it's relating to programming or developing a game, rather than just memorize or discuss concepts. If you just memorize everything from a book, then you're relatively useless. And I've had quite a few girlfriends like that, to be perfectly honest, who were psychologists, and they just memorized everything from a book and couldn't read anyone at all. Quite funny. Obviously very important to have practical skills as well. I mean, consider things like driving a car, programming. So according to Sean, the following are some of the key problems in teaching design and in fact software engineering. So it's learnable but not didactically or discursively teachable. It's a holistic skill and parts cannot be learned in isolation, but by experiencing it in action. So how you actually learn something in a sort of holistic way without actually learning the parts in isolation is quite beyond me, but it seems to be in there. It depends upon the ability to recognise desirable and undesirable qualities. And learners instead must be learned by doing. So it's a creative process in which a designer comes to see and do things in new ways. So, okay. It's a social process. All learning includes three dimensions. So the cognitive dimension, so knowledge and skills, emotional dimension, feelings, social dimension, communication and cooperation. And all of which are embedded into a sort of societally situated context. So that's sort of drawing it back to games. So that's what games are. So thinking of games, MMORPGs, networks, Xbox Live, oh my goodness, that's just goes to show how all these slides are. Principles of constructivist learning environments. So games are in fact constructivist learning environments. So you start with an authentic problem, should be realistic and sufficiently complex. You encourage learners to take ownership for the learning, allow learners to develop their own process to reach a solution. Provide learners with the opportunity to experience and appreciate others, the perspective of others as well. And provide opportunities for interaction, collaboration, whether that's going to be learner to learner, learner to teacher, or learner to system. Okay. You're ensuring that the learning environment motivates, engages. So this is some of the principles that you would possibly use when designing games for learning. You're providing feedback mechanisms, we'll talk about that later, support mechanics, scaffolding as well. Be flexible in terms of supporting different learning styles, that's incredibly difficult. As we've discussed the different sort of learning styles, we're looking at COBES, simulator, diverger, accommodator, those particular ones. For all four of them, I can remember them. Simulator, converger, diverger, accommodator. Yes, got it. Okay, so all the different sort of learning styles. Mario Soflano, if you remember him, looked at pictorial learning styles and textual learning styles, which was the sort of, I believe, the Felder-Silverman model. But how do you actually support that in games? Very, very difficult to do so. And Mario wrote an entire sort of PhD on it. Provide opportunities for reflection and provide a sort of integrated assessment as well. So we will discuss assessment integration in a later lecture. Okay. So with the exception of assessment, games are in fact constructivist learning environments, and I would probably say that these slides are a tad dated in that sense, because assessment is more or less sort of put into to games now. You do, suppose that you do have assessment integration, particularly with serious games, but even in some entertainment games now, I would sort of slightly argue that assessment is integrated in there, or it can be, depending on how the game is constructed and what particular puzzle is implemented. Okay, so all of that was probably quite interesting, but you're wondering, is it relevant? It probably isn't to this module in terms of the assessment, because you wouldn't necessarily have to use any of that, but it may be relevant to your honours depending on what you're doing. So it was supposed to be an interesting lecture to provide you with some of the detail. Now, if you wanted to look up learning models, there's a sort of link there, and it lists all of them, and it's incredibly interesting. And as I say, you should have a little bit of knowledge of all the sort of learning models. Do look at them and see which particular one sort of suits you, which ones you could relate to, and which ones you think that you possibly follow as well. And it's very, very good to have a knowledge of that sort of thing and an appreciation of how you learn. Because there is nothing worse than someone that doesn't have that appreciation. For example, in terms of memorization, I was, basically I was in Masonic circles at one stage, and a great part of that is to memorize a whole load of textual ritual. Now, if you do that in a sort of iterative fashion, then everything's fine over a long period of time. But if you just sort of jump into it and you forget to learn that in a sort of gradual way, what sort of happens is you think that you can read something and instantly commit it to memory, and you can't. So you begin to sort of delude yourself. And I've seen a lot of people make that sort of mistake where they simply read over something before they're supposed to recite it. And then they go up and of course they completely and utterly blank. And the only way that you can make something like that become sort of second nature is through rehearsal and letting things gradually sink in. And an appreciation of learning theories and models can sort of help you do that. If you pick one and you say, well, this is actually the way that I sort of learn, and I can then apply that to my everyday life. I'm taking control of my own metacognitive strategy formation, and that helps me. It's like really taking control of your diet, taking control of your exercise plan. Your brain is no different. You realise what particular model you're going to follow, and that's to your benefit, if that makes sense. Okay, right, I shall leave it there, and have a good day.